and when walls couldn't contain love. The fluorescent lights of C Block hummed their endless drone as Officer Maya Torres made her final rounds at 11 p.m., her boots echoing against the cold concrete floors of Riverside Women's Correctional Facility. She had learned long ago to keep her eyes forward, her face impassive, her heart locked away somewhere, safe where the daily parade of human suffering couldn't reach it. But on this particular February night, everything she knew about survival behind these walls was about to shatter, because sometimes love finds you in the most impossible places, and sometimes the person who saves your life is the one you're supposed to be guarding. Inmate 47392, whose real name was Ellie Chen, sat on the edge of her narrow bunk with her head in her hands, shoulders trembling with silent sobs that she tried desperately to muffle. This was her third year in a place that seemed designed to strip away everything that made a person human. The other women in her cell block had hardened themselves into something unbreakable, but Ellie couldn't seem to find that switch inside herself. That place where you turned off your feelings and just existed day by day. She had been convicted of embezzlement, a white-collar crime born from desperation when her mother's medical bills became mountains she couldn't climb, and while the courts had shown her no mercy, she still couldn't shake the crushing weight of her own conscience. Tonight marked the anniversary of her mother's death, a death that happened while Ellie was locked away. Unable to hold her hand one last time, unable to say the words that daughters always think they'll have more time to say, Maya heard the crying before she saw its source. 5 years of working in corrections had trained her to distinguish between manipulative tears and genuine anguish, and these sounds came from somewhere deep and true. She should have kept walking. The protocols were clear about maintaining professional distance, about not getting emotionally involved with inmates, about remembering that kindness could be weaponized by those looking for weaknesses to exploit. But something in those muffled sobs reached past Maya's carefully constructed walls and touched a place in her own heart that she thought had calcified long ago. She stopped at cell 14, where Ellie sat bathed in the weak glow of the security lights, looking so small and broken that Maya felt something crack open inside her chest. Their eyes met for just a moment, and in that brief connection, both women recognized something familiar in the other. Maya saw her own loneliness reflected back, the kind that comes from living behind walls even when you carry the keys, the exhaustion of pretending to be invincible when inside you're barely holding yourself together. Ellie saw genuine compassion in Maya's dark eyes, the first real human warmth she'd felt in 3 years, and it was almost more painful than the isolation had been, because it reminded her that she was still capable of feeling, still human despite this place's best efforts to convince her otherwise. Maya didn't say anything that first night. She simply stood there for a long moment, her presence a quiet acknowledgement of Ellie's pain, before continuing her rounds with a heart that suddenly felt too heavy for her rib cage. The next night, Maya found herself unconsciously slowing her pace as she approached cell 14. Ellie was reading by the dim light, a worn paperback that looked like it had passed through 100 hands before reaching hers. When she looked up and their eyes met again, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that went deeper than words. Maya knew she was playing with fire. The department had strict fraternization policies, and even the appearance of favoritism could cost her the job she desperately needed to support her younger sister through college. But there was something about Ellie that called to her, a gentleness and intelligence that seemed so incongruous with her surroundings that it made Maya's heart ache. She started bringing extra books from the prison library, leaving them on the distribution cart where Ellie would find them during recreation time, always careful to make it seem random, always protecting them both from scrutiny. Over the following weeks, they developed a careful language of glances and small gestures. Maya would pause fractionally longer at Ellie's cell during counts, and in those stolen seconds, they would exchange looks that said everything their voices couldn't. Ellie began to live for those moments, for the way Maya's stern expression would soften almost imperceptibly when their eyes met, for the tiny smile that would ghost across her lips before her professional mask slipped back into place. It was the most dangerous thing either of them had ever done, this silent communication that was building into something neither could name but both could feel growing stronger with each passing day. The other officers noticed nothing, too busy with their own routines and politics. But some of the inmates began to whisper, their survival instincts honed to detect any shift in the normal order of things. The turning point came on a sweltering July evening when the prison's ancient air conditioning system failed and tensions throughout the facility reached a boiling point. A fight broke out in the common area, a vicious brawl that sent other officers scrambling for backup, while inmates scattered in every direction. In the chaos, Ellie found herself cornered by an inmate named Rhonda, a woman serving life for violent offenses who had decided that Ellie's educated manner and refusal to engage in the usual prison hierarchies made her a target. Rhonda's fist was already raised when Maya appeared seemingly from nowhere, putting herself between them with a commanding presence that made even Rhonda think twice. The moment hung suspended in the hot, thick air, violence trembling on the edge of eruption, until Maya's quiet authority diffused the situation and other officers arrived to restore order. Later, when the facility had been locked down and an uneasy calm had settled over the cell blocks, Maya violated every rule in the book and stopped at Ellie's cell. Her hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline from the near disaster still coursing through her veins, mixed with the terrifying realization of how much it had mattered to her that Ellie was safe. Ellie stood at the bars, her face pale but her eyes bright with unshed tears and something else, something that looked like the reflection of what Maya was feeling. They didn't touch, couldn't touch, but their hands hovered inches apart on either side of the cold metal, so close that Maya swore she could feel the warmth of Ellie's skin. In whispers so soft they could barely hear each other, they finally spoke real words, not about prison or rules or the future, but about the truth they could no longer deny. Maya confessed that thinking of Ellie had become the only thing that made her own lonely existence bearable, and Ellie admitted that Maya had given her a reason to survive when she had been ready to give up on everything. The weeks that followed were an excruciating dance of restraint and longing. They both knew that acting on their feelings could destroy everything. Maya would lose her career and possibly face criminal charges for misconduct, while Ellie could be transferred to a higher security facility where the conditions were far more brutal, her parole chances diminished by any disciplinary actions. But love, especially the kind born in desperate circumstances, doesn't always listen to reason. They found small, careful ways to nurture what was growing between them. Maya would leave notes hidden in books, nothing explicitly romantic but filled with the kind of understanding and encouragement that Ellie had been starving for. Ellie would leave her own messages in the prison library's suggestion box that only Maya checked, coded in references to books they'd both read, a secret language that belonged only to them. The prison chaplain, a kind woman named Reverend Patricia, who had seen more than her share of human complexity behind these walls, noticed the change in both women. Ellie had stopped looking like she was merely enduring each day and started showing small signs of hope, participating in education programs and even smiling occasionally. Maya had lost some of the hardness that usually characterized correctional officers. After years on the job, though, she'd also developed a nervous energy that Patricia recognized as the tension of someone living with a dangerous secret. Patricia said nothing, but she made sure to create opportunities for both women to attend the weekly chapel services, a neutral space where they could at least exist in the same room without suspicion, where Maya could watch Ellie sing hymns with a voice that made something in Maya's soul ache with beauty and pain. 8 months into their impossible connection, Ellie's parole hearing approached. She had maintained perfect behavior, completed her GED and started college courses through a correspondence program, and presented exactly the kind of rehabilitation story that parole boards like to approve. But the possibility of freedom brought with it a crushing dilemma. If Ellie was released, she would step back into a world where she and Maya could potentially have a real relationship, but Maya would still be working in corrections. With all the ethical complications that entailed, they couldn't discuss it openly, couldn't plan or prepare, could only exchange increasingly desperate looks during Maya's rounds as the hearing date grew closer. The night before Ellie was scheduled to appear before the board, Maya broke protocol in the most serious way yet. She requested a private meeting with Ellie under the guise of a security concern. And in that small interrogation room with its two-way mirror and recording equipment that Maya had ensured was switched off, they finally touched. Their hands met across the scarred metal table, fingers intertwining with a desperation that spoke of months of denial and longing. Maya's professional composure shattered completely as tears streamed down her face, and Ellie reached up to gently wipe them away, her touch so tender that it made Maya sob harder. They both knew this might be their last private moment together. If Ellie made parole, Maya would have to recuse herself from any involvement in her case, and they would have to wait the mandatory 2 years before any relationship between a former inmate and correctional officer could be considered ethical or legal. 2 years felt like an eternity when they'd already spent so many months unable to truly be together. Ellie made Maya promise something that night. She made her promise that no matter what happened, Maya would take care of herself, would find happiness, would remember that she deserved love and softness in her life. Maya couldn't speak, could only nod and hold Ellie's hands like they were the only real thing in the world. The parole hearing went better than either of them dared hope. Ellie's transformation was evident to everyone on the board. Her articulate presentation of her rehabilitation plan and her genuine remorse for her crimes, painting a picture of someone who had used her time behind bars to become better rather than bitter. The board granted her parole with a 6-month transition period in a halfway house, during which she would be prohibited from contact with anyone from her incarceration except approved counselors and caseworkers. Maya watched from the correctional staff observation area as Ellie received the news, saw her face crumple with a mixture of joy and grief, and knew that Ellie was thinking the same thing she was. Freedom meant separation, at least for a while, and that separation might prove harder than the careful distance they'd maintained behind these walls. On Ellie's release day, Maya volunteered to work even though she wasn't scheduled. She told herself she just needed to see Ellie walk out those doors into the sunshine, needed that image to carry her through whatever came next. The processing took hours, an endless parade of paperwork and final instructions and the return of personal items that Ellie hadn't seen in 3 years. Maya watched from her usual post, maintaining her professional demeanor even as her heart was breaking. When Ellie finally walked toward the exit with her small bag of belongings, she paused at the final checkpoint where Maya stood. Their eyes met one last time, and in that look passed a promise that needed no words. "Wait for me," Ellie's eyes said. "I'm waiting," Maya's answered. The 2 years that followed were the longest of both their lives, but they were also years of growth and healing. Ellie rebuilt her life piece by careful piece, finding work as a bookkeeper for a nonprofit that helped other formerly incarcerated women, attending therapy to work through her trauma and guilt, creating a foundation for the future she hoped they might share. Maya, inspired by Ellie's courage, applied for a position in the department's Reform and Rehabilitation Division, moving away from the cell blocks and toward work, focused on preparing inmates for successful reentry. She also started her own therapy, unpacking the loneliness and walls she'd built around herself, learning that love didn't have to be a weakness, but could instead be the strongest thing she'd ever experienced. They communicated through the only legal channel available, letters reviewed by Ellie's parole officer but precious nonetheless. The words they exchanged were careful and coded, discussing books and philosophy and dreams for the future in ways that anyone reading would find innocent but that carried deeper meanings for them. Ellie wrote about the sunset she saw from her new apartment window and how it reminded her of someone's eyes in the fluorescent light of a place they both wanted to forget. Maya wrote about the garden she was starting to grow and how some plants needed patient tending through difficult seasons before they could bloom. Each letter was a lifeline, a promise kept, a demonstration that what they'd found in the most unlikely of places was real enough to survive the test of time and distance. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe in the power of love to transform and heal even in the darkest places, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that hope can be found anywhere. Your support helps spread these stories of resilience and humanity to others who might need them. 729 days after Ellie walked out of Riverside Women's Correctional Facility, she stood in a small coffee shop on the edge of town, her hands trembling as she stirred sugar into a cup she wouldn't actually drink. The parole period had officially ended at midnight. For the first time, they could see each other without breaking any laws or violating any ethical codes. When Maya walked through the door, still in civilian clothes from her day at the reform office, their eyes met with the same recognition that had sparked between them that first night, 3 years ago. But now there were no bars between them, no cameras watching, no consequences except the ones they chose. They stood frozen for a heartbeat. And then Ellie crossed the distance between them and Maya's arms, opened to receive her, and finally, they were able to hold each other the way they'd dreamed of for so long. Please leave a comment below telling us what part of Maya and Ellie's story resonated most with you. Their story didn't end with that embrace in the coffee shop, but rather it began there, built on a foundation of patience and sacrifice that most people would never understand. They faced judgment from some of Maya's former colleagues who couldn't see past the circumstances of their meeting, and Ellie sometimes struggled with the shame of her past despite Maya's constant reassurance. But they also found unexpected support from Reverend Patricia, who officiated their small wedding 2 years later, and from Ellie's parole officer, who told them at their final meeting that their story had restored her faith in the possibility of genuine rehabilitation and second chances. They built a life together that honored both their pasts and their futures, working together at the nonprofit that Ellie had joined, advocating for criminal justice, reform, and supporting other women, making the difficult transition from incarceration back to society. Sometimes Maya would wake in the night and reach for Ellie, still half convinced that she was dreaming, that she'd open her eyes to find herself alone in her small apartment, preparing for another shift behind those walls. But Ellie would be there, solid and warm and real, and she'd pull Maya close and whisper the same thing she'd whispered in that interrogation room years ago, that they had survived the impossible and come out on the other side, still capable of love, still capable of hope,